In a world oversaturated by English language reinterpretations of foreign language films like Spike Lee's Oldboy and the Disney live-action remakes, it's easy to see why the term remake carries such a stigma these days. Now don't get me wrong, when I hear Train to Busan is getting a US remake, I roll my eyes too. But it can be easy to forget how great remakes can be when done right. The Departed, the 1983 Scarface, John Carpenter's The Thing. These three are all commonly mentioned when talking about the greatest movies of all time. And guess what they all have in common? Yep, adaptations of previously existing films. And not to dunk on the source material, but you can definitely make the argument for any of these being better than the originals, though I do have a particular fondness for the 1932 Scarface. But I believe the best kind of adaptation is one that forms a dialogue with the original. Film doesn't exist in a vacuum, and there are some really great examples that use one movie as a blueprint and take the concepts of that original in a new direction. Straw Dogs and Cold Fish are two very interesting movies made by two very interesting people. The former was directed by Sam Peckinpah in 1971. Peckinpah was primarily a director of westerns, and fittingly, he was an outlaw in the filmmaking scene. His movies typically contain high-octane, over-the-top violence and brutality, and the man had a reputation for being violent in real life too.
We'll begin shooting in just a moment, just as soon as Mr. Peckinpah gets here.
One more mistake, you're on the bus. Got it!
Sion Sono, the director of Cold Fish, is also kind of insane. I mean, the guy joined a cult at age 17. He also got accepted to Berkeley University, but ditched all of his classes and didn't learn English, instead opting to spend all his time watching cheap B-movies and porn. Like Peckinpah, Sono is pretty controversial, but personally, I have a soft spot for him. I'd even go so far as to say he's one of my favorite directors working today. He covers complex subject matter in a way that no other director really does. I guess you could say he's the sex to Peckinpah's violence, but his movies do also tend to feature graphic violence as well. I think it'll be interesting to take a look at how these radically different directors tackled similar subject matter. Straw Dogs follows Dustin Hoffman as David, who moves from the US with his British wife Amy, played by lesser-known actress Susan George, to rural Cornwall. He's a mild-mannered academic type, a mathematician who believes in pacifism. The rugged locals don't take too kindly to the fact this weenie ended up marrying one of their own. And after a series of malicious abuse from the locals, the film culminates in a grisly finale. David's masculinity, or lack thereof, plays a large role in the movie. He's not taken very seriously by the townsfolk who constantly jeer and mock him. He's also kind of emasculated by his wife in a lot of the earlier scenes. Though the film works as a character study, the themes of masculinity apply to the male cast as a whole. The idea of the male gaze is in play. Amy wears some revealing outfits, which the camera likes to linger on, and the men in the town are often seen eyeing her up and flirting with her. David's relationship with Amy is a bit rocky at the moment, and they don't see eye to eye on a few things.
If you want to help, then get your friends to finish. Get the garage makers and the rat catchers, get them all to finish. I love you, Amy, but I want you to leave me alone.
Peckinpah's previous movies were made with Warner Brothers, but due to going over budget with his last movie, The Ballad of Cable Hogue, and the slew of controversy that came with films like The Wild Bunch, they weren't exactly too keen on offering him any more good directing jobs, which is why he moved to England to direct this. Now, The Wild Bunch was controversial because of the extreme violence for 1969, coupled with the fact it nearly single-handedly brought an end to the romanticization of the Wild West that was present in a lot of westerns at the time. John Wayne, the traditionalist that he was, even stated that the movie, quote, destroyed the myth of the Old West. But Straw Dogs was an even bigger controversy at the time. Now, this is a 70s movie, so it has some subject matter that's presented in a way that wouldn't be seen as acceptable today. There's not really any dancing around it, since it's vital to the themes of the film. Halfway through, there's a pretty disturbing depiction of sexual assault. What makes this scene all the more notorious is how the female character is presented, seeming to enjoy the assault towards the end due to having a history with the assailant and her rocky relationship with her husband. The film certainly doesn't glorify the content in the scene, especially since the character later has painful flashbacks to it, but the subtext is a bit hard to swallow. Peckinpah has clarified that the scene is rooted in his past fears of previous failed marriages, and I think using a scene like this to show a man's failure to protect his wife might be going a little too far. The ending of Straw Dogs is almost equally as controversial, and I have mixed feelings about it as well. Towards the end of the film, a local named Henry accidentally kills a young woman, of Mice and Men style. David and Amy run into him with their car on their way home, and David, not wanting to leave him wounded out on the street, takes him back. Some of the unruly townsfolk learn of these events and eventually come knocking on David's door looking for him. They give David one chance to give up Henry. Amy also wants to kick Henry out due to his unsavory history, but David is fed up with the bullying and intimidation and is pushed over the edge by the ordeal. He slaps his wife around, telling her to be obedient, and he refuses to allow the townsfolk to barge into his home.
This is where I live. This is me. I will not allow violence against this house.
The town magistrate arrives to calm things down, but one of the men, the father of the girl who Henry accidentally killed, accidentally shoots the officer due to his extreme intoxication. Since they've already drawn first blood, they decide to go all the way and break into David's house. What ensues is a brutally violent climax. David undergoes a massive character transformation and fends off the attackers with extreme measures. The title Straw Dogs is a reference to a discussion from the Tao Te Ching, an ancient Taoist text. Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu states that people are viewed by heaven and earth as straw dogs. A straw dog is a ceremonial object used in religious sacrifices. In other words, people are viewed as being of ceremonial worth, but are then done away with indifference. You can say the townsfolk that David kills are straw dogs, people who he initially attempts to appease, only to dispatch when he deems he must. But the real straw dog is figurative, that being the moral codes held by David. Though David isn't religious, he preaches pacifism with a dogmatic fervor, only to throw those ideals aside when they become inconvenient to him. Though David's pacifism can be seen as a mere facade, he does seem to get some sort of pleasure from antagonizing others.
You're a scientist. Can you deny the responsibility?
Can you? After all, there's never been a kingdom given to so much bloodshed as that of Christ.
And this hypocrisy can be seen from the onset. Though David claims to be anti-war, the whole reason he moved to England was so that he could get away from the political uproar in America over the Vietnam War. The message of Straw Dogs is pretty nihilistic. The central point is that all men hold a propensity toward violence and are only a few steps away from reverting to beasts. Despite all his preaching, after the pent-up frustration throughout the film, David makes the plunge and becomes a violent savage. After the invaders are killed, he drives Henry back home, and we're left with this concluding piece of dialogue.
I don't know my way home.
That's okay. I don't either.
Based on this line, it seems that David's transformation is meant to be a dark point of no return. David's home in this case representing the person he used to be. But I think the film fails to actually make a statement about the brutality. A lot of viewers come to the conclusion that the film promotes toxic masculinity and violence, and I can sort of understand how someone would come to that conclusion. Thinking it over some more, I don't think that was the intent of the film. The men in the town are definitely a negative representation of macho violence, but aside from David becoming an animal himself, we aren't really shown any consequences to this behavior. David technically achieves his goals through violence. He protects his home and his livelihood from the other men, and his wife becomes more obedient, even joining in on the violence to save his life. This might be a one-dimensional interpretation, but it felt to me that the world is shown as the cruel force, and that men naturally open up their inner animal in order to survive in this world. Cold Fish also deals with themes of violence and masculinity, but the director puts his own spin on the concepts of straw dogs. Something I find interesting is that while Peckinpah's movies typically star male protagonists, a lot of Sono's movies revolve around female protagonists, so he's naturally going to have a different approach to a story about masculinity. Like Straw Dogs, the film follows a mild-mannered husband who transforms into a violent macho male in the finale. Cold Fish is the kind of reinterpretation that uses the characters and themes of the original as a jumping-off point and creates a whole new story around those themes. The film also attempts to arrive at a different thematic conclusion. Nobuyuki Shamato, our main character, owns a tropical fish store in Shizuoka. His relationships with his second wife and his daughter, they aren't going so well. His wife is played by Megumi Kagurazaka, the actual wife of Sion Sono. She's pretty resistant to his affections, and his daughter, Mitsuko, is in a rebellious phase. Not only does she refuse to listen to her father, but she also bullies her stepmom. She even begins shoplifting, which is where the film begins. Shamato is called in by the manager of the supermarket where Mitsuko was caught shoplifting. A wealthy patron of the supermarket happens to come by, and he convinces the manager to let Mitsuko go. The patron is Yukio Murata, who happens to own another, much larger tropical fish store, which he invites Shamato to come see. Murata seems like a nice guy, and he even offers Mitsuko a job at the store, but we come to learn pretty quickly that he's not a great guy when he essentially assaults Shamato's wife. Something to note is that contrary to Straw Dogs, she's clearly more okay with the assault, and she even explicitly accepts Murata's advances before we see any actual sex. She's implied to also continue to cheat on Shamato after this. She clearly isn't being satisfied by her husband. Along with that, Shamato finds out firsthand about a certain hobby of Murata and his wife Aiko. They like to kill people. Straw Dogs was based on the 1969 horror crime novel The Siege of Trencher's Farm, but Cold Fish takes influence from real-world events. Sono was inspired by real-life couple Gen Sekine and Hiroko Kazama. The two owned a pet store and would scam some particularly wealthy customers out of their money before killing them with poison. If you're familiar with Sono, though, you'll know that this based on a true story bit at the beginning is only a half-truth, and the other half is his own material from his own crazy brain. Shamato is roped into helping the Muratas dispose of the victims' bodies, and this is where the film's themes of masculinity come into play. Straw Dogs implied that violence and toxic masculinity was simply part of human nature, but Cold Fish seems to argue that it's based on world outlook and societal conventions. The dynamic between Shamato and Murata is a very interesting one, because even though Murata is a murderous psychopath, he's kind of framed as the better man in a way. This is helped by Denden's charismatic performance. The playful way in which he goes about killing people is also an example of Cold Fish's extreme dark comedy. The dynamic is used to enhance the themes of identity and individuality that are typically present in Sono's films. Murata is a serial killer, but he's accepting of who he is, and he's able to be happy because of that. It's a reversal of Sono's previous movie, Love Exposure, where the protagonist learns to accept the flawed aspects of himself, but the villain is unable to find their own identity. I really like how Sono is able to implement his themes through his antagonists. Cold Fish is nihilistic, perhaps even more so than Straw Dogs, since one of the takeaways is that life on Earth doesn't have any greater purpose. Murata accepts this, and he only sees the Earth as an insignificant rock. Shamato, on the other hand, repeatedly attempts to search for a greater meaning to his life, only to find none. While a big problem I had with Straw Dogs was that it didn't really do quite enough to criticize the man who David became, Cold Fish is a lot more explicitly critical of its protagonist. Japanese society is based on respect and isn't particularly fond of the Western ideal of the independent alpha male, but Shamato doesn't earn anything from being polite. He's unable to rein in his daughter, his his wife doesn't find him attractive, and he's roped into the main dangerous situation of the film due to his lack of agency. But when Shamato attempts to become the quote-unquote alpha male, he's portrayed as nothing but a violent brute. He sexually assaults his wife, and unlike the scene with Murata, this is clearly presented as an assault. It's disturbing, difficult to watch, and Shamato's attempted display of power is almost pathetic. In a state of pure despair, Shamato commits suicide at the end of the film, while Mitsuko merely laughs at him. Despite his new, much more violent approach to his rebellious daughter, he's still unable to gain her respect. Understandably so. You can interpret the ending as sheer nihilism, and you wouldn't be completely incorrect. But I think there is a message, and this message is that there should be a middle ground. A man shouldn't be a punching bag, but he also shouldn't abuse his power over others and behave with malicious intent. At the same time, he shouldn't worry about what society wants him to be, and he should carve out his own identity, without basing his persona on another person's. The relationship between these two films is really interesting to me, and I think Cold Fish is one of the better examples of cinematic adaptation. It has a very different sequence of events from the original, but it comments on the same themes. In a way, I see Cold Fish as a response to Straw Dogs. Too often, remakes are made as replacements for the old, seemingly archaic original, but completely miss the point or simply fail to capture the charm of the original. I also have my problems with video game remakes, but this mindset is particularly narrow-minded when it comes to film. We still have easy access to these older films, and instead of replacing them, I think this idea of movies commenting on other movies is really interesting, and it makes the medium feel a lot more interconnected. That's all for today. Make sure to check out my other analysis on Code Geass if you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you all again in another video.